My name is Eli Gold. I am the president of the Gold Institute for International Strategy. With me here today is one of our senior fellows, Saul Montes Bradley. Saul, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start by maybe you can introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background and why you chose to join the Gold Institute.
Sure. I have a rather unusual background. I was born in South America to an American family. I was raised in several countries in South America and Europe, and eventually returned to the US, at the time trained as an electrical engineer. That didn't last long, and eventually I went to work for the UN, and from then to a series of airlines until I ended up with my own airline called Aeroposta, with 747s around the world.
Where was that airline based?
It was based in Buenos Aires, Argentina, although I was based in Miami, Florida. So you could say that nominally it was based in Argentina, but in practice all operations were run out of Miami. And from there, in 1993, the Argentine government gave a monopoly of routes to the US to Iberia as a sweetener for the sale of Aerolíneas Argentinas. And suddenly I had a bunch of planes with wonderful technical certificates, but no authority to fly anywhere. So that was the end of that airline. And I then went to work for Wall Street, where I was until 2017. In the meantime, I was always particularly interested in world affairs, and I did abundant research on a number of issues, but mostly concentrated on terrorism, both Islamic and non-Islamic terrorism, the Middle East, Europe, and South America, and published a series of articles and a book on that. And
What was the name of the book?
Gander. And I refer in the title to incompetence and the rise of Islamic National Socialism. I think these all happened in the background while people were not paying attention. And as a consequence of that, I got the invitation to join you in the Gold Institute, and the idea of a think tank concentrated on strategies as opposed to policy is what tempted me the most, because the one point that I have always been making in my books is how policies are somewhat haphazard, and responding to the events of the moment is a very responsive way of doing business, and unfortunately the way the world works, that doesn't function as well. And it is more important to have the correct strategy long term than to have every policy right.
Excellent. So the goal, as we know, the difference between the Gold Institute for International Strategy and many other organizations is we focus less on the policy, as you stated, but more on the strategy, on how to implement the policies, either that originate within our center, or maybe even originate from government or even other institutions. Another difference is for American think tanks, is usually American think tank is focused from the American perspective. We're focusing on things that are American interests, and so on. The Gold Institute is different. The Gold Institute is looking at things from a Western perspective. I guess you can look at it from the perspective of what happens in Europe. It's not a European issue, but quite frankly, it's a Western issue because we're going to see it happened here in the United States. The example that I like to use is migration to Europe. And now we see, and it was only a matter of time before that happens to the United States, and in fact, we're dealing with that right now. What are some of the issues that you are concerned about, that you're going to be potentially focused on? Are there any ideas of policy or strategy issues that you're going to be focused on from a strategic perspective?
Well, the most important one for me, obviously, there are several interests that do not escape our attention from time to time, but the most important one for me is the development of a strategy to eliminate the use of terror as a political strategy. And I see us involved into the fourth decade of a war against a form of National Socialism that has adopted terrorism as a strategy, not as a series of law enforcement events. And I have the feeling that until we develop a strategy to combat the ideology behind the people using these methods, we're not going to be successful. We're going to be successful catching one or two bad guys every now and then, which unfortunately have a tendency to walk free within a couple of years, particularly in Europe. But we need to develop a strategy to combat the ideology of National Socialism behind terrorist movements throughout the world, not just in the US.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean when you say that you want to combat the ideology of using terrorism?
Yeah, well, people see, for instance, Islamic terrorism or jihadism or radical Islamism. It's funny when we cannot name an enemy and we have to resort to all kinds of euphemisms, means that we actually do not understand what's going on. And one thing that I'm always reminded of is in 1953, there was a significant exodus of former Nazi officers from Europe and South America to Egypt, where under Gamal Abdel Nasser, they set up units of special operations to attack Israel within its borders, and who were defined as the new secret weapon of the fatherland by Johann von Leers. This is the root of what we know as Islamic terrorism today. After the Camp David Accords, they turned on their own governments, and now they are trying to get the Muslim population to join them by provoking a Western reaction on Muslims residing in Europe and the US. And we are, through our policies, playing into their hands. At the same time, these terrorist groups like Al-Jihad, one of the founding members of Al-Qaeda, used to run training camps in Libya where trainees would come from the IRA in Ireland or ETA in Spain or Monteneros or Tupamaros or FARC in South America, and they work perfectly well together. So you have Catholic atheists and Muslim terrorists training together, sharing weapons and tactics for the advancement of a brand of National Socialism that they're not shy in promoting. In fact,
multicultural terrorism,
multi-religious terrorism, morphing into the cultures of the areas where they operate generally, and they do so with one thing in common, also in von Leers' parlance, he called on his fellow Nazis to join him in Egypt. When I say a significant number, 5,000 former SS officers set up residence in the Mahdi district in Cairo. And not as refugees of any sort. One of them went on to become the Minister of Information, another one the head of the secret police. Gamal Abdel Nasser, whose brother translated Mein Kampf into Arabic,
Wow.
had more than a little sympathy for this.
Sure.
And he referred to a sea of green flags from Morocco to Baghdad, fighting against colonialism, imperialism, and for social justice as the last hope for us. And in a way, still is. And of course, the flags these terrorist movements choose to define themselves are along the lines of anti-imperialism, anti-West, anti-colonialism, and for social justice. Now, their version of social justice may not conform to yours and mine, but it certainly conforms to a specific model that you can trace to the 1920s in Central Europe.
Right. That's good. And one of the other areas that you're focused on right now, and this is maybe in 3 minutes or less to explain, is is political corruption, and political corruption even within the U.S. government. And how, number one, maybe you can take, without getting too detailed, because we're short on time here. What is it that you're looking at? But more so, as we look strategically to the U.S. national security and our own defenses, how do you think that affects our? How do you think that has an impact, negative or positive, whatever it may be?
Well, what I'm looking at has a very negative impact. The one thing that makes us Americans is not our language or our country of origin or our tribe, but the fact that we subscribe to a set of principles and ideals enshrined in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence. We are unique in that sense in the world, as a country based on an idea, not on geography, culture, or tribe. Anything that destroys that relationship between being an American and that set of ideas is terribly destructive for our society, and ultimately can be the undoing of this experiment. One of the things I'm looking at is a phenomenon that has been happening in the last 120 years or so in the US, with ever more complicated laws that create a divorce between people and government. One that I was looking at, and by the way, this is not something new. In the early 1700s, explaining why the people of Massachusetts had rebelled against Governor Andros in the Revolution of 1689, Cotton Mather wrote, to be a very poignant phrase, whatever laws Governor Andros made were as difficult for us to understand as dangerous for us to break, thereby rendering every citizen in this colony a criminal. And he had a point. When laws are so complicated that judges have to confess, I'm not understanding this, is too convoluted, I need a couple of weeks to study it, and lawyers cannot agree on its meaning, what hope does the regular citizen have? And what protection from arbitrary prosecution? There was a time in the US that any such law would have been declared unconstitutional on its face. And yet we have a number of them in our books that are as impossible for us to comprehend, as dangerous for us to break. The Foreign Agents Registration Act is a case in point. You're not going to find two lawyers who agree on the meaning of three phrases in it. You're not going to find a judge that understands it without deep study and help from his clerks. And perhaps that's the reason why in the past 100 years only 9 cases were ever brought to court. But now it's coming up more often, and it's coming up more often as a way of silencing opinion. If one writes an editorial or an op-ed in the New York Times expressing an opinion favorable to, I don't know, the state of Israel or trade with Brazil, somebody can construe it as ultimately benefiting that country and therefore require that the writer be registered under FARA. I think that is preposterous. And I think that the selective prosecution of these laws also guarantees a form of censorship that we should not have. Ultimately, if we are fighting for a better set of ideas and a more free society, if we let it slide this way, then what are we fighting for?
Now, how do you see that this issue is important for the Gold Institute for International Strategy to focus on when you do your work?
Oh boy. you do understand.
That's an open-ended question.
Yes, you do understand that A is an open-ended question. B, I would probably do it anyhow.
Without a doubt.
But I do think that if we look at the U.S. in itself, our strategy should be to bring back the principles that founded this nation to its legislation and the application of that law, so that we continue to be the freest country in the world. Otherwise, our credibility suffers with our liberty, and we end up without a free system, without our liberties, and without any influence in the world. If we are going to fight the totalitarian ideology embraced by terrorists, how can we do it when we apply the same principles to our citizens? So the strategy is, if we're going to defeat the ideology of terrorism, we have to do it abroad and at home, and defeat totalitarianism wherever it rears its head.
Understood. Well, thank you for spending a few minutes to introduce yourself, introduce the work that you're planning to do. If we want to see more about Saul's background and the work that he's going to be doing, take a look at goldiis.org. goldiis.org. Thank you, Saul.
Thank you.